Okay, I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's titled Region-Wide Surveys and Pest Forecasting for Advancing Minnesota IPM, and it will be given by Anthony Hanson. I'm Lene Jess. I'm one of the co-directors for the North Central IPM Center, and we're one of 4 regional IPM centers that are supported by USDA NIFA, the Crop Protection and Pest Management Regional Coordination Program, and we have a mission to coordinate IPM across regions. As we go along, if you have questions, would you please type them in the Q&A, which is on the bottom of your Zoom screen. And today we'd like to welcome Anthony Hanson. Anthony is from University of Minnesota, and he is the IPM Extension, Education, and IPM Co-Coordinator. So thank you for joining us today, Anthony, and take it away.
Yep, thank you, Lene. Here we go. So just to start folks off, we mentioned that I'm one of the IPM co-coordinators. My other half of Minnesota is Marissa Shu. She focuses more on the horticulture side of things, whereas I cover more field crops. But then we also cover different areas in IPM too as well that kind of intermingle between the two. So we'll get into pollinators a bit and other areas, especially say like pesticide safety too as well. So this is something just across Minnesota, the two of us coordinate IPM, but then we have a whole lot of other people in Minnesota Extension that work in different areas of IPM, whether it's IPM specialists like Bruce Potter, or a lot of our researchers too as well. So what we're going to focus on today is basically what we're doing in Minnesota in terms of regional pest surveys and forecasting. This is one area that I tend to focus on a lot. And I did mention Marissa covers horticulture side of things a little bit, mostly because I'm presenting today. We'll be focusing a bit more on the field crops, but obviously there's a lot of things that we won't be able to cover that in just the 20 minutes or so that we have for this session. So we'll kind of just carve out a little bit of what goes on in these pest surveys and forecasting, and showing a little bit about what University of Minnesota is actually doing, what tools we have available for growers, but then how do we get that information out to them as well. So one of our tools that we do use a lot is called the Minnesota Crop News blog. I know other universities have a similar system sometimes too, but this is basically just a way that any extension educator or researcher can go and post an article about what's going on, either in the field or for some events that are currently going on. In this case, we have one of our programs, strategic farming, where we basically have online sessions. We're focusing on weed management for that session. Again, that's field crops. A little bit over on the horticulture side, we also have one for fruit and vegetable news. In this case, just mentioned for weed control, pumpkins and winter squash, looking at our pest management across both field crops and horticulture as well. So we have a few different tools people can use there. But then we do have a couple other things we like to look at in Minnesota too. We do have a specialized podcasts. One is the IPM podcast for field crops that I'm the host of. We had episodes since about 2018 now, so it's been going on for a few years. And usually these will be updates either during the summer based on some conditions, whether it's some insect that's starting to become a problem or something to keep an eye out for. And then we switch to winter programming a bit too, looking on what's going on, just giving a little bit of history on IPM potentially. In this case, we looked at one with Ken Ostley and looking back on corn entomology and IPM and extension for the last 38 years. There's also another podcast in horticulture, What's Killing My Kale. That's another one that folks can look up if they're interested. But overall, we're looking at what do we do with IPM in Minnesota? And I always like to make sure that we're actually defining what IPM is. In this case, it's just our science-based decision-making process that we're identifying risk from the pests and the management tools that we're using for them. So obviously, we're going to be looking at things like pesticides, natural enemies, host plant resistance, or plant genetics, and so on. But one thing that we like to focus on in Minnesota especially is what's going on with the sampling. And that's where we talk about our surveys and pest forecasting, because that's giving a lot of information to growers on what they can use for basically tactics of deciding when's the best time to go out and potentially scout, or what's your potential risk in a field that they may have. So like I mentioned, scouting, that's really our centerpiece for decision making. And that's why there's this idea of having a lot more focus on when we time scouting and giving more guidance to growers on that specifically. And that's something that's not unique to Minnesota. So overall, especially this time of year in winter, it's something where you think about, well, there's not a lot going on in the field right now, but there's a lot of time for growers to either plan or potentially worry about issues. So it's a good time to give guidance of what's going on right now. And then especially once winter ends, how do we give guidance for when to direct when they should be out in the field and what they should be looking for? And we can use regionally available information either in Minnesota or nearby states to help give some of this focus to growers. So one of the things that we do in Minnesota is we have one of our small grains and soybean surveys that we do. This is mostly across Western Minnesota, where we have a lot of our regional educators based that are involved in this. And this starts off with interns we have in early May or so. They start in wheat, and then they'll move over to soybean later on in the year. So we get to use quite a bit of scouting resources, at least, based on both the Minnesota wheat growers and soybean growers that sponsor this. So we had in 2021, about 380 fields that were visited for small grains, looking for pests like wheat stem maggot, wheat stem sawfly, grasshoppers, and so on. And then over in soybeans, we had a bit over 800 fields we looked at, looking for soybean aphids, spider mites, grasshoppers. And the grasshoppers were quite a bit of an issue in some fields last year, especially because of our drought conditions. And I should mention that I mentioned a lot of the insects here. I'm an entomologist by training, so I'll focus a lot more on those. But obviously, we do cover other issues. We get into diseases and weeds as well. So just to give a little primer on how these maps are set up for these surveys, we work together with North Dakota State University as well to have kind of these joint maps we put out. And one example here for small grain is just wheat growth staging, gives growers an idea of what they might be seeing in the region if their crop is further ahead or further behind of other growers in the region. Now for pest management especially, we're looking at more what's going on with those. So that's just the primer on what's going on with the crop growth staging. When we move into pests, we actually do have quite a few different options between North Dakota and Minnesota that we can look at. So one is just looking at aphids and wheat in this case. You can see that North Dakota didn't have too many issues in 2021, at least in this snapshot that I picked for aphids and wheat. But in Minnesota, we actually saw high numbers of aphids pretty early on. So this is one example where we wanted to get this information out to growers. And we use our sources like that Minnesota Crop News blog to send out alerts to say, hey, keep an eye out in your fields. This might be a time where you're actually seeing threshold aphids a lot earlier than normal. And we actually did see some disease transmission showing up earlier than we expected. Barley yellow dwarf virus that actually were causing dwarfing symptoms that we actually don't see in Minnesota because it comes so late. So I mentioned the wheat just a little bit there for a snapshot. Over on the soybean side of things, we had the scouts out as well. We really didn't have too many issues for soybean aphids last year, so that was good for the growers. But in this case, this map is showing just soybean aphid incidents in this case. So there are quite a few fields, Western Minnesota and some North Dakota, that had aphids. Well, the value of these surveys is we're actually doing the counts as well. When you look at actual numbers of aphids per plant, they were all relatively low. So this was a case where we're being able to tell growers that, there's pretty low risk for soybean aphid issues, at least at this time of year, but still keep an eye out in your fields. So this is one where we can give that guidance for a little bit of both surveys and a bit of a forecasting idea. But in this case, towards the end of the season, so far aphid populations are pretty low. Now, I do mention a couple disease cases here. One is tar spot of corn. This is a case where some folks are doing other surveys as well. We hear from growers, they get back to us wondering about what they're finding in their fields. And this is what's been beneficial, at least in Minnesota especially, is for tar spot of corn, if folks aren't familiar with it, it's a new disease that's coming in across the upper Midwest. And in this case, not native to the area, but when you go by the name tar spot, it's because these spots in the leaves, you can't scrape them off, unlike some other diseases. So it's something that's pretty identifiable, especially if you show growers and teach them how to scout for it. They may find out it's in their fields. So we had it in southeastern Minnesota starting off in 2019, and it seems to have been spreading or at least being found in later years. So cases like Stearns and Benton County in central Minnesota, we're picking up more cases there where they weren't found before. And these are cases of growers getting back to us and saying, hey, I'm wondering about what's going on in my field. So this is a two-way street when it comes to these surveys that we do in Minnesota, at least. And jump over to corn a little bit on the insect side of things. We do have some surveys from Ken Osley and Bruce Potter where they're using sticky card traps to figure out what corn rootworm adult populations are looking like in the state. So you can see in some of these maps, we're going from 2019 on the left to 2021. They're actually increasing populations, it looks like, of corn rootworm, whether it's Western or Northern species. So it's something we're trying to get the word out to growers that, yep, we are having issues with corn rootworm. It seems like increasingly So be out there scouting your fields, especially for adults, and say August or so, and you can get an idea for the next year, again, to that forecasting idea that you have a higher risk in your fields for the following year. So one of our other main surveys we do on the insect side of things for corn is we call the European Corn Borer Fall Survey. And this is just where we randomly sample 2 fields per county in September through October to get an idea of what the end of the year populations are. And we do have some known non-BT fields we'll try to look through as well too. So basically what we'll do is when we go out into these fields, if we find any stalks that look like they may have feeding damage from European corn borer, we'll do stalk dissections, look for the number of larvae, and then tunnel length as well. And now if folks do remember that European corn borer is something that we haven't dealt with as a pest too much lately. It's been relegated to a minor pest, whereas if you remember from the mid-90s, it was actually a major pest. So back when we did these surveys back then in the 90s, we were in some cases getting over 300 larvae per 100 plants sampled. So those were obviously very high numbers, well above thresholds. As we move into these maps, you look at 2018 through 2020, it's very low numbers of larvae. In some cases, it's very hard to find even a single larva in this particular region of the state. So we're being able to tell growers that, overall, there's a low risk for European corn borer, but there may be pockets sometimes. And I'll show a map or two coming up on that later. But just a little update for 2021 for what we show growers is it looks like populations were even lower. Was that part of drought conditions or just overall low populations? We're not sure, but we only found a larva or two in the whole state last year in these surveys. So it's showing that these surveys are beneficial for growers. At least they get more information from us seeing region-wide what their risk might be. And that's because there are some growers that do have non-BT fields. And these maps are showing a bit about what we do when we combine either non-BT fields with randomly selected fields. And in some cases, we do pick up on pockets of high tunneling numbers in some parts of Minnesota. So in 2018 and 2019, northwestern Minnesota did seem to have a few issues in non-BT fields where those were picked up. But then you move over to 2020, that seemed to not be an issue for that year. So it really can vary depending on year potentially sometimes. So that's what's going on with pest surveys. So I want to move a little bit over into pest forecasting. And one way we can do that is with degree days. And I know many folks are familiar with that when it comes to, say, your corn growing degree days or for crops and plants in general. But we can use the same for pests, especially insects as well. And this can apply to diseases and obviously weeds too. In the case of insects, they're essentially cold-blooded in the way that basically their temperatures are matching the environment roughly. They aren't warm-blooded like us where we maintain a constant temperature. And that temperature is what drives how quickly they can develop. And we use those degree days to measure really how quickly development's occurring and to get an idea of what's out in the field before we even get out there. So just one example, you can have an insect life cycle. They'll go through that egg nymph stages potentially for a bug in this case over to adult. If it's a cold season, that development's going to be delayed. If it's warmer, you might be cycling through those generations a bit quicker. So we provide some tools based on this for degree day risk models, looking at a few different species so far. This is on one of our websites, VegEdge, where we house a few different species right now. This is in the process of being expanded. So if some of these species are of interest to people, that's one place they can look at. And one example I do want to give is the first on that list is alfalfa weevil. We do have some issues with that in the state. And it'll be skeletonization of leaves and alfalfa. You have about one generation per year. So that can make management a little bit easier if you can predict when that generation is occurring. So what we can do to predict emergence or basically development of a pest like this is using those degree days. And where we can pull information from is one source, the National Phenology Network. They have a hub that has data generated from NOAA. And it gives basically daily max and min temperatures at about 2 kilometer square resolution grids. So it's very fine level details. If you think about some of these weather stations for growers, they may be, the closest one may be about 30 miles away. And that's the case for my family's farm. We don't have too many great resources for temperature sources. So this is something that can give an idea of what's going on basically between those weather stations. And that's some calculations going on in the background, trying to interpolate that data There's some variability in that as well. So if you have a weather station right next to your farm, that might be a better source of information potentially there. What we can do to generate these degree days is figure out what either instar we're at or potentially when you should be scouting. So when, say, first instar larvae are showing up, that's when growers would want to be looking, in this case, about 300 degree days. So in this map here, May 27th, about northern Minnesota is where we'd be expecting to start scouting at that point. But if you look at central Minnesota as a reference, we're about second instars in that case. Now, the value of this data I'm talking about from National Phenology Network and through NOAA is that it also gives about a 6 or 7 day forecast. So we can provide both current degree days and about a week out for the forecast as well. So if you remember from that previous map, this is just the 7 day forecast. We're expected to be about third instar larvae for that next week out there. So that's something where you give an idea, especially if you move further south into the other regions down into Iowa, you can get an idea of when people might be able to stop scouting as well. So that's degree days. One of the other things we can do is look at insect overwintering, or basically freeze mortality. In this case, is what I'll focus on. So there's a few different strategies that insects have. It can be somewhat similar for diseases and plants as well too. The main one is they are trying to avoid the water in their cells freezing. So this is strategy 2 on this. There are other ones. I won't cover too much for this talk, but they're just there if people are interested in them. So one example I'm going to give is about soybean aphid. So if you think back, actually this should be January 7th for daily low temperatures. This is a map of Minnesota where we were hitting about -30 in some places in the state. And if you look across, other parts of the region, it wasn't getting much above -15 or so. So for those of us in Minnesota, -30 is, getting a little bit cold for us. And it's the same for insects too. So one of the questions I like to always look at when it gets cold like this is what's going on with soybean aphid, one of our main pests of soybean. And they like to overwinter basically under the bud of the buckthorn leaf there. So these are adults in this picture in the fall. They'll lay their eggs there. The eggs overwinter. So if you're hitting -30, should that be killing off most of the soybean aphids? And actually, that's maybe about half should be dying off at that point. So at about -29 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when about 50% of eggs should be freezing. The water inside the egg freezes. That should cause mortality. One of the benefits of using air temperature in this case is that soybean aphid is generally exposed to the air. So many of our other pests are under the snow, under the soil. They have a lot more protection. But if you look at this map here, you're hitting about 90% mortality for soybean aphid in north central Minnesota. But a lot of the rest of the state, we're seeing very little mortality, if any at all. And then you get to the rest of the region, we're not expecting much for mortality either. So in this case, this is an example where, yes, winter temperatures do affect our insect populations, but they can also migrate back in from surrounding regions. So for Minnesota, we're likely not going to be able to say that we have a low risk for soybean aphid because they could be migrating in, and we have populations that probably didn't experience too much winter mortality. So between surveys and pest forecasting, there's always a question of what can you do with these tools, and that ropes back to what we do for our extension implementation program in Minnesota, is trying to get this information out to growers, ideally prioritizing their scouting plans. If they get an idea of what's happening in their region, or if the timing is right, they can make a little bit better use of their time, but also try to do some year-long planning, like I mentioned at the beginning of the session, talking about especially winter when folks are kind of just getting ready for things. If they can start to plan a little bit more for their pest issues, especially earlier on, potentially maybe in the fall when they're buying seed, they can get an idea of if they need to change up what they're using for, say, BT corn and so on. But this is always a reminder. I like to give people that these pest forecasting tools and surveys, they're not a replacement for scouting. It's giving people a heads up that there may be an issue in their region, and that gives us more ability to act quicker on the extension side of things. But really, it's the ground sleuthing that matters for the growers in the field if they really have an issue in their individual field, or maybe their neighbors have an issue, they don't, or vice versa. And always remember that these surveys and forecasts have a margin of error. So again, we might be sampling and miss a pest out there potentially. It may be a huge issue in the center of a field, not on the edge potentially. Issues like that can always come up. So we always want to caution that to growers as well. So I think with that, I can take any questions. I have just a few key links up here. I do want to thank USDA NIFA for funding for the IPM program in Minnesota, then also some of our research and promotion councils for our different commodity groups as well that provide funding for these surveys that we do as well.
All right, thank you, Anthony. I did put some of the links that Anthony has there in the chat, so you can copy and paste them if you'd like to look at them later. Anthony, I have a couple questions. How many growers in Minnesota actually scout their own fields, or how many hire consultants?
I think it depends what they're looking for and kind of what the size of their operation is. So I know a lot of co-ops, they will have agronomists who are out there scouting for them already. So that's part of the services. And I don't have exact numbers on that. But I know a lot of people where even if they have bigger operations, especially for soybean aphid, they are still out there scouting themselves sometimes too. We always like to see if there's higher adoption going on for scouting for specific pests. But I think if there's more of a broad look at scouting, if someone's not aware of disease issues, they're not out looking for it, but their agronomist might be. So I think there's definitely a good mix, and there may be more weighted heavily towards some of the crop professionals doing some of that scouting. But again, it'll be pretty pest specific, I think.
Okay, great. And then a question about European corn borer. Why do you think the populations have dropped so much the last several years? Do you think it's because of the BT corn, or is there another reason?
Yep, and that's something I think I just briefly mentioned maybe, but yeah, it is BT corn. There's that suppressive effect. Basically, about 96 when that was first on the market, that's when populations just drop suddenly. So that's very well established that BT suppress European corn borer. We are concerned about resistance still popping up, and that's why we do these surveys still. I know in Canada, there has been some documentation of resistance occurring. So we're keeping an eye in Minnesota. So far, looks like we're good. But like I mentioned, non-BT fields, they can still flare up sometimes. I have seen fields where we were at threshold levels. So it's still a possibility and something we like to remind folks about, because a lot of people haven't had to deal with European corn borer for 20, almost 30 years now.
Yeah, so along with that, I know you said you do the surveys, but do you ever get reports from growers that they have damage or have to treat for it?
For European corn borer?
Yeah.
I don't work directly with growers as much on that one, so I haven't heard calls, but I think I have heard through the grapevine, kind of like I mentioned, those non-BT fields. Those are growers that other folks at Minnesota collaborate with, and they definitely are concerned about it, at least. So there are some calls I think that do come in. People, maybe volunteer their fields because they have had concerns, and that's how we, kind of get that cycle going of potential sample sites we can get.
Okay, great. And then have you seen any trends in your pest emergence over the years, maybe due to climate change or just harsher winters or less harsh winters, or have you seen any change in your pests that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I think I'll work backwards in that one. Is we've have had some years, especially where it was a cool, wet spring. You definitely can see when emergence is slowed down or basically suppressed. So it'll be obviously later in the season when something emerges. But overall, there are a lot of studies, and even in Minnesota, we've had some phenology projects where we're just tracking either plants or some insects over time when they're emerging, and it does seem like they are speeding up over time, where they're emerging a lot earlier than they used to, even 50 years ago or so. There's been some good data sets out there that people have worked with, and it's interesting to see how that varies. And obviously, it varies within a short amount of time, but the trending is that things are emerging a lot earlier.
Okay. And then I just have a question. I know that in that area in Minnesota, North Dakota, some of those areas, I was just out in Montana, and they were all talking about the drought that they've had the last year or 2 or 3. So do you think there are going to be any pest changes due to that?
I think the main one folks want to look out for, and this isn't just the case for Minnesota. I know obviously, like I mentioned, Dakotas, but across the region, grasshoppers, I think, are going to be something that people may need to be concerned about next year. It's basically primed where they've had higher populations. Diseases don't keep them down as much when we have drought conditions. So there's basically high populations ready in the fields. If we have a cool, wet spring, that may suppress them. But if we're still in a drought, we might see really bad grasshopper issues where people maybe haven't had to deal with those for quite a few years. So that's the one I think I'd pick out from the drought conditions to keep an eye out for next year. Maybe spring will help us out, but that just remains to be seen until things actually start to warm up.
All right, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the Q&A. So again, I want to thank you, Anthony, for doing your webinar today. And I wanted to let everybody know that our next webinar will be on Wednesday, March 16th, and Jim Jasinski from Ohio State University will be the speaker. And his topic is From Bees to Beans, a 5-part review of the OSU IPM program. And if you want to have more information on that or register for it, you can go to our website, which is just ncipmc.org. And while you're there, you can also sign up for our newsletter, The Central Issue, if you'd like to get more information on what our center does. So again, thank you, Anthony, and we appreciate your time.
Yep, thank you.